The howl of the autumn wind carried Grace Gibson's sobs into the darkening South Dakota sky, as she stumbled away from the grand house that had been her home for barely 3 months, clutching nothing but a small carpet bag and the tattered remains of her dignity. It was October 1879, and the Black Hills were already preparing for winter. Grace pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she cast one last glance at the imposing 2-story home belonging to her mother-in-law, Harriet Gibson. The older woman stood on the porch, arms crossed, her face set in stone as she watched her daughter-in-law leave. "You'll not return until you've learned proper respect," Harriet called out, her voice carrying on the wind. "A decent wife would have given my son children by now." 3 months married and nothing to show for it. Grace's cheeks burned with humiliation as she quickened her pace down the main street of Hill City. Her husband Thomas had been dead barely 2 weeks, taken by a fever that swept through the mining camps. Before his body was cold, Harriet had begun her campaign to break Grace's spirit, blaming her for everything from Thomas's death to the poor harvest. The final straw had come that morning when Harriet discovered Grace had sold one of her own brooches to pay for food, accusing her of stealing family heirlooms. Without Thomas to defend her, Grace had no protection from her mother-in-law's wrath. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the pines, Grace found herself at the edge of town with nowhere to go. She had arrived in Hill City as a mail-order bride from Boston, her parents dead and her prospects limited. Thomas had seemed kind enough in his letters, but their brief marriage had been more practical than passionate. Now she was alone again, a widow at 22, with winter approaching and not a friend in the world. The first fat raindrops began to fall as she stood at the crossroads, unsure which direction offered any hope. The town's few establishments were closing for the night: the general store, the assayer's office, and the Silver Dollar Saloon, where raucous laughter spilled out into the night along with the tinny sounds of a piano. "Madam, you all right there?" The deep voice startled Grace, and she spun around to find herself facing a tall man on horseback. In the gathering darkness, she could make out broad shoulders, a Stetson pulled low, and the gleam of a badge on his chest. "I'm quite well, thank you," she lied, her voice betraying her with a slight tremor. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse closer. As he stepped into the light cast from a nearby window, Grace could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of days in the sun and wind. Dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes, a startling blue, regarded her with concern. "Sheriff Mitchell Stone," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "And forgive me for saying so, but you don't look well at all. You're soaked through, and there's not much out this way but the mines and timber camps." Grace clutched her carpet bag tighter. That is, I'm on my way to." The lie died on her lips, replaced by a sob she couldn't suppress. The sheriff's expression softened. "You're Thomas Gibson's widow, aren't you? I was sorry to hear about his passing." "Yes," she whispered, wondering how much more he knew if the whole town was aware of her humiliation. Sheriff Stone glanced at her small bag, then back toward town, his eyes narrowing as understanding dawned. "Did Harriet Gibson turn you out?" Grace looked away, unable to form the words. Her silence was answer enough. "That woman," he muttered, shaking his head, "always had more pride than sense." "Look, Mrs. Gibson, please call me Grace," she said quietly. "I don't think I deserve the Gibson name anymore." Mitchell studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Grace, then. I can't in good conscience leave you out here. My sister Abigail runs a boarding house just outside town. She'd be happy to take you in for the night, and tomorrow we can sort things out." "I haven't any money," Grace admitted, shame coloring her words. "Let's worry about that later," he said, his tone brooking no argument. He led his horse closer and offered his hand. "Can you ride?" Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding. Her father had taught her to ride in the countryside outside Boston, before illness and debt had taken everything. Mitchell's large hand was warm and calloused as he helped her mount, then handed up her carpet bag before swinging up behind her. The rain was falling steadily now, and Grace was grateful for the warmth of the man at her back as they rode through the darkened streets. They passed the imposing Gibson house, where a single lamp burned in an upstairs window. Grace turned her face away. "Harriet Gibson is a hard woman," Mitchell said after they'd ridden in silence for several minutes. "The mines made her husband rich, but money never softened her, when her boy married an Easterner with no fortune and no connections." He trailed off, seeming to realize the impropriety of discussing such matters. "She wanted him to marry Lucinda Thornfield," Grace finished for him. "The banker's daughter. She never forgave me for taking her son away, though in truth, I didn't know I was causing such discord." Thomas's letters never mentioned his mother's disapproval. "Men rarely tell the whole truth when they're courting," Mitchell observed dryly. They turned onto a narrower road that wound through a stand of pines. In the distance, Grace could make out a large house with welcoming lights in the windows. As they approached, she saw it was a handsome two-story structure, not as grand as the Gibson place but solidly built, with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. "This is your sister's boarding house?" Grace asked as Mitchell helped her dismount. "It is. Though truth be told, it's more mine than hers. I built it after I came back from the war thinking to start a cattle operation. Never quite got around to it, what with being elected sheriff. Abigail manages it now, takes in travelers and the occasional boarder." Before Grace could respond, the front door swung open, spilling warm light onto the porch. A woman with Mitchell's same blue eyes and dark hair stood there, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mitch, what on earth are you doing out in this weather? And who's this poor soaked creature you've brought home like a stray kitten?" Mitchell guided Grace toward the porch with a gentle hand at the small of her back. "Abigail, this is Grace Gibson, Thomas Gibson's widow. She needs a place to stay tonight." Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. "Of course. Come in, come in. I've just made a stew and there's fresh bread besides. You look half frozen, poor thing." Before Grace could protest, she was whisked inside to a warm kitchen that smelled of beef and herbs. Abigail clucked and fussed, taking her wet shawl and setting her bag by the fire to dry. Mitchell disappeared to tend to his horse, returning minutes later with raindrops glistening in his hair. "Sit, both of you," Abigail commanded, ladling stew into bowls. "Grace, you must be starving. Don't stand on ceremony here." Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. At the Gibson house, she'd been given the barest portions, another of Harriet's subtle cruelties. She took a spoonful of the rich stew and nearly moaned with pleasure. "This is wonderful," she said sincerely. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness." "Kindness doesn't cost a thing," Abigail replied, shooting a meaningful glance at her brother. "And we've room to spare. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Mitchell cleared his throat. Grace was Thomas Gibson's mail-order bride, only been in Hill City a few months before he passed. 3 months and 12 days, Grace said softly. "We were married the same day I arrived." Abigail's expression softened with sympathy. "And now that old witch has thrown you out, hasn't she? Well, you're better off away from there. The Gibsons have money, but they've never known how to treat people right." "Abigail," Mitchell warned, but there was no heat in it. Grace took another spoonful of stew, savoring the warmth and flavor. For the first time since Thomas's death, perhaps even before she felt something like safety. I can pay for my lodging with work, she offered. I can cook and clean, and I'm a fair hand with a needle. We'll discuss all that tomorrow, Abigail said firmly. Tonight, you need rest. After supper, Abigail showed Grace to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. There was a real bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with clean towels, and a window that looked out toward the hills. The bathroom's at the end of the hall, Abigail explained. We're modern enough to have indoor plumbing, thank goodness. I'll bring you some night clothes. When Abigail returned with a flannel nightgown and a robe, Grace had already unpacked her meager belongings: 2 dresses, some undergarments, a Bible, and a small photograph of her parents. Is this all you have? Abigail asked, her voice gentle. Grace nodded. Harriet said everything in the house belonged to the Gibson family, even my wedding ring. She held up her bare left hand. Abigail's mouth tightened. That woman. Well, you're safe here now. Get some rest, and we'll figure things out in the morning. After Abigail left, Grace changed into the borrowed nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the soft quilt. For the first time since Thomas had fallen ill, she felt tears of relief rather than despair. She said a small prayer of thanks before slipping beneath the covers, the exhaustion of the day pulling her quickly into dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting to see the austere furnishings of her room in the Gibson house. Instead, the cheerful patchwork quilt and simple pine furniture reminded her of where she was and how she'd come to be there. Grace dressed quickly in one of her 2 dresses, a serviceable blue cotton that had seen better days, and made her way downstairs. She found Abigail in the kitchen, bustling between the stove and a table where 3 men sat eating breakfast. Good morning, Grace, Abigail called cheerfully. Come have some breakfast. These gentlemen are our other boarders. Mr. Jenkins is our schoolteacher. Mr. Dawson works at the assayer's office, and Mr. Riley here is a drummer passing through. The men nodded politely, though Grace noticed their curious glances. News traveled fast in small towns, and she suspected they knew exactly who she was. Mitchell's already gone to his office, Abigail continued, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before Grace. But he said to tell you he'd stop by later to see how you're settling in. That's very kind of him, Grace said, wondering why the thought of seeing the sheriff again brought a flutter to her stomach. She attributed it to gratitude and nothing more. After breakfast, the men departed for their day's work, and Grace insisted on helping Abigail with the dishes and chores. As they worked, Abigail told her about Hill City and its inhabitants, filling in the details that Grace had never learned during her brief marriage. The town's growing, Abigail explained as they hung laundry in the bright October sunshine. The mining's not what it was during the gold rush days, but there's still good money in it, and the railroad might come through next year, which would change everything. It seems like a nice place, Grace ventured, though I haven't seen much of it. Harriet didn't approve of me going about town unescorted. Abigail snorted. That woman would disapprove of the sun rising if she could. Did you know she tried to stop Mitchell from becoming sheriff? Said he wasn't from the right sort of family. But he seems very capable, Grace said. Oh, he is. Served in the war, then worked as a deputy over in Deadwood before coming here. People respect him, even if he doesn't have Gibson money. Abigail pinned a sheet to the line with more force than necessary. Speaking of which, you ought to have a widow's pension from Thomas's estate. Did Harriet mention that? Grace shook her head. No, she said I hadn't been married long enough to claim anything. That's nonsense, Abigail declared. You were his lawful wife. I'll have Mitchell look into it. By midday, they had finished the chores, and Abigail insisted that Grace rest while she prepared lunch. Instead, Grace found herself wandering to the porch, gazing out at the vista of hills and pines. The air was crisp but not cold, the sun warming her face as she stood there. She was still on the porch when Mitchell rode up, dismounting with the same fluid grace she'd noticed the night before. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing hair that gleamed almost blue-black in the sunlight. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gibson Grace," he corrected himself. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and hair pulled back in a simple bun. "Your sister has been most kind." "Abigail has a good heart," he agreed, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. "I wanted to let you know I spoke with Judge Patterson this morning about your situation." Grace's heart quickened. "My situation? Your rights as Thomas Gibson's widow. Regardless of what Harriet says, you're entitled to a portion of his estate. Judge Patterson has agreed to look into the matter." "Oh." Grace hadn't dared hope for such intervention. "I don't wish to cause trouble." Mitchell's expression hardened slightly. "It's no trouble to see justice done. Harriet Gibson may own half this town, but she's not above the law." Before Grace could respond, Abigail appeared in the doorway. "There you are, Mitch. Come in for lunch. I've made ham sandwiches and there's fresh apple pie." Inside, as they sat around the kitchen table, Mitchell explained more about his conversation with the judge. "The law is clear. As Thomas's widow, you're entitled to at least a third of his personal estate, if not more. Harriet can keep the house and business interests, but your husband's personal property and a share of his money should come to you." "I doubt she'll relinquish anything willingly," Grace said softly. "She won't have a choice once the judge makes his ruling," Mitchell assured her. "It may take a few weeks, but you'll have what's rightfully yours." "In the meantime," Abigail interjected, "you'll stay here with us. I could use the help around the place, especially with winter coming on. We usually have more boarders when the weather turns." "I couldn't impose," Grace began. "It's no imposition," Mitchell said firmly. "Consider it an arrangement that benefits us all. You need a place to stay and Abigail needs help. I'd say that's fair." Grace looked from brother to sister, overwhelmed by their kindness. "Thank you both. I don't know what would have become of me otherwise." "No need to think on that," Abigail said briskly. "Now, who wants pie?" The next few days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Grace helped Abigail with the cooking and cleaning, mended linens, and even assisted with the bookkeeping, discovering a talent for figures that surprised her. The male boarders treated her with polite deference, addressing her as Mrs. Gibson and tipping their hats when they passed her in the hall. Mitchell came for supper most evenings, bringing news of the town and occasionally small gifts, fresh apples from a farmer's orchard, a ribbon for her hair that matched her blue dress, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Each time, he presented these offerings with a gruff casualness that suggested they were nothing special, but Grace treasured each one. A week after her arrival at the boarding house, Mitchell appeared at the door looking more serious than usual. "Grace, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice tight. "Harriet Gibson is causing trouble." Grace's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "What kind of trouble?" Mitchell glanced at Abigail, who was kneading bread dough nearby. "She's telling people you left Thomas's sick to pursue other interests, that you neglected him in his final days." Hot anger flashed through Grace, followed quickly by despair. "That's a wicked lie. I never left his side, not once during his illness. I bathed his fevered brow, spooned broth between his lips, prayed over him day and night." Her voice broke. "I know," Mitchell said gently. "Anyone who saw you during that time knows how devoted you were, but Harriet is influential and some people listen to her. What can I do?" Grace whispered. "Show them who you really are," Abigail said firmly, dusting flour from her hands. "You can't hide away here forever. You need to go into town, hold your head high, let people see you're a decent, hard-working woman." Mitchell nodded. "I agree. In fact, there's a harvest social at the church this Saturday. Everyone in town will be there. It would be a good opportunity to show Harriet she can't break you." Grace's stomach clenched at the thought of facing the townspeople, their curious stares and whispered judgments. But Abigail and Mitchell were right. Hiding away only lent credence to Harriet's lies. "I have nothing suitable to wear," she said, glancing down at her faded dress. Abigail waved away her concern. "I have a green dress that would suit you perfectly with a few alterations. You're a bit taller than me, but we can let down the hem." "And I'll escort you," Mitchell added. "No one will dare speak ill of you in my presence." Grace looked up at him, touched by his protectiveness. "Thank you, Sheriff Stone." He smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Mitchell, please. I think we're past formalities, don't you?" The next few days were busy with preparations for the social. Abigail's green dress was altered to fit Grace perfectly, emphasizing her slender waist and bringing out the hazel of her eyes. Abigail also insisted on lending her a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to their mother. "You'll be the loveliest woman there," Abigail declared as she helped Grace with her hair on Saturday evening, arranging the chestnut locks in a simple but elegant style. "And with Mitchell on your arm, no one will dare snub you." "I'm not trying to make an impression," Grace protested weakly, though in truth, she was pleased with her reflection in the mirror. For the first time since Thomas's death, she looked like herself again, not a grieving widow, not a cast-off relation, but a young woman with life ahead of her. Mitchell arrived promptly at 6, dressed in a clean black suit rather than his usual sheriff's attire. He stopped short when he saw Grace descending the stairs, a look of genuine admiration in his eyes. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You're very handsome yourself." Abigail, watching from the doorway, made a small sound of satisfaction. "You two go on and enjoy yourselves. Don't hurry back on my account." The church hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty pumpkins, corn husks, and baskets of apples. A small band played in the corner, and tables laden with food lined one wall. Nearly everyone in Hill City seemed to be in attendance, dressed in their Sunday best. Grace felt eyes turn toward her as she entered on Mitchell's arm. She held her head high, though her heart was pounding. Mitchell guided her through the crowd, stopping to introduce her to people she hadn't met during her brief time as Thomas Gibson's wife. "Mrs. Gibson, how lovely to see you," said a plump woman with kind eyes. "I'm Martha Patterson, the judge's wife. We were so sorry about your husband." Thomas was always such a polite young man. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Grace replied, genuinely touched by the woman's warmth. "And don't you worry about a thing," Mrs. Patterson continued, lowering her voice. "My husband tells me he's looking into your situation. Harriet Gibson isn't the only one with influence in this town." Heartened by this show of support, Grace found herself relaxing as the evening progressed. Not everyone was as welcoming as Mrs. Patterson. Some of Harriet's friends gave her cold nods, or pretended not to see her, but many people greeted her kindly, expressing condolences for her loss and interest in her well-being. Mitchell stayed close by her side, his solid presence a comfort. He was clearly respected in the community. Men sought his opinion on matters of town business, and women, particularly unmarried ones, fluttered around him with obvious interest. Grace found herself inexplicably annoyed by these attentions, though she had no claim on the sheriff's affections. "Would you care to dance?" Mitchell asked as the band struck up a waltz. Grace hesitated. "Is it proper? I'm still in mourning, technically." "I think you've mourned enough," he said quietly, "and a dance is just a dance." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, his movements confident as he guided her through the steps. Grace had learned to dance at school in Boston, but she'd never had a partner who made her feel quite so graceful. "You dance very well," she observed. "My mother insisted we learn," he replied with a small smile. Said no child of hers would shuffle around a dance floor like a bear with sore paws. Grace laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuineness. How long had it been since she'd laughed? They were halfway through their second dance when a hush fell over the room. Grace looked up to see Harriet Gibson standing in the doorway, resplendent in black silk, her face a mask of rigid propriety. Mitchell's hand tightened slightly at Grace's waist. "Steady," he murmured. Harriet's gaze swept the room until it landed on Grace and Mitchell. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she made her way toward them with regal slowness, acknowledging greetings from various townspeople as she passed. "Sheriff Stone," she said coldly when she reached them. "I see you've taken an interest in my son's widow." "Mrs. Gibson," Mitchell replied with a cordial nod. "Yes, I've been helping Grace settle some legal matters regarding her late husband's estate." Harriet's eyes narrowed. "There are no legal matters to settle. Everything belonged to my family before Thomas's unfortunate marriage, and everything reverts to the family now." "That's not how the law works, madam," Mitchell said, his voice still pleasant but with an edge of steel beneath. "Judge Patterson agrees." A flush of anger stained Harriet's cheeks. "We'll see about that." She turned her attention to Grace. "I'm surprised to find you here, dancing and making merry when my son is barely cold in his grave, though perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. You never did show proper respect." Grace felt the sting of the words, but Mitchell's steady presence gave her courage. "I respected and cared for Thomas until his last breath, Mrs. Gibson. I'm sorry you choose not to believe that." "Care," Harriet scoffed. "If you had cared, you would have given him children, secured the Gibson legacy. Instead, he died without an heir, and now you expect to profit from his death." Several nearby dancers had stopped to listen, and Grace was acutely aware of the spectacle they were creating. Mitchell must have sensed her discomfort, for he stepped slightly in front of her, facing Harriet directly. "Mrs. Gibson, this is neither the time nor place for such a discussion," he said firmly. "If you have legal concerns, I suggest you speak with Judge Patterson during his office hours." Harriet drew herself up, affronted. "I don't take orders from you, Sheriff. My family built this town when you were still chasing outlaws in Deadwood." "Nevertheless," Mitchell replied, "you'll find that, as sheriff, I'm responsible for maintaining peace and order at public gatherings." "I'd hate to have to ask you to leave." A collective gasp went up from those watching. No one had ever threatened to remove Harriet Gibson from any social function. For a moment, Harriet looked as though she might continue the confrontation, but then her gaze moved past Mitchell to something or someone behind him. Her expression changed subtly. "Judge Patterson," she said, her voice suddenly honeyed. "How lovely to see you this evening." The judge, a tall man with impressive side whiskers, stepped forward. "Mrs. Gibson, Sheriff Stone." He nodded to each, then glanced at Grace. "And Mrs. Gibson the younger. I trust you're all enjoying the festivities." "Indeed," Harriet said smoothly. "Though I was just remarking to the sheriff that it seems a bit soon for my daughter-in-law to be participating in such gaiety." Judge Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Well, in my experience, grief takes different forms for different people. Some find solace in quiet contemplation, others in the company of friends." He turned to Grace with a kindly smile. "And I believe young Mrs. Gibson has had more than her share of quiet contemplation lately." Harriet's smile became fixed. "Perhaps you're right, Judge. If you'll excuse me, I see Mrs. Thornfield waving to me. As Harriet moved away, Judge Patterson turned to Mitchell. "Walk with me a moment, Sheriff. I have some information about the matter we discussed." Mitchell glanced at Grace. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" "Of course," she assured him, though in truth, she felt exposed without his protective presence. "I'll wait by the refreshment table." As the men walked away, Grace made her way to the refreshment table, grateful for a moment to compose herself. She was pouring a cup of punch when a shadow fell across the table. "Mrs. Gibson." Grace looked up to see a young woman about her own age, pretty in a pink dress with blonde ringlets framing her face. "Yes, I'm Lucinda Thornfield. I wanted to introduce myself." Grace froze. This was the woman Harriet had wanted Thomas to marry. She searched the pretty face for signs of resentment or triumph, but found only what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Miss Thornfield," Grace acknowledged cautiously. "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am about Thomas," Lucinda said, her voice soft. "We were childhood friends, and while I know Mrs. Gibson had hopes for a match between us, Thomas and I never saw each other that way." "Oh," Grace said, surprised by this frank admission, "and I wanted to say—" Lucinda glanced around, then leaned closer. "Don't let Harriet Gibson intimidate you. My father is on the town council, and he says you're entitled to your share of Thomas's estate, no matter what she says." "Thank you," Grace said, touched by this unexpected support. "That's very kind of you to say." Lucinda squeezed her hand briefly. "Thomas made his choice when he sent for you, and from what I hear, you made him happy in the short time you had together. That's what matters." With a quick smile, she was gone, swallowed up by the crowd. Mitchell returned a few minutes later, his expression thoughtful. "Judge Patterson has been reviewing Thomas's will," he explained quietly. "It seems your husband left specific provisions for you that Harriet has been concealing." Hope flared in Grace's chest. "What sort of provisions?" "A sum of money, for one thing, and a small piece of property at the edge of town. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give you independence." "Independence," Grace repeated, the word tasting sweet on her tongue. "I never thought—" "The judge will make it official on Monday," Mitchell continued. "Harriet can bluster all she wants, but the law is clear." Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. With her own money and property, she wouldn't have to depend on anyone's charity, not even the Stones. "Would you like to dance again?" Mitchell asked, offering his hand. Grace placed her hand in his, feeling a connection that went beyond gratitude for his help. "I would like that very much." The next day, Sunday, dawned clear and cool. Grace accompanied Abigail and Mitchell to church, wearing her blue dress with the ribbon Mitchell had given her. She felt Harriet's glare from across the church, but kept her gaze forward, focused on the minister's words about faith and perseverance. After the service, as congregants mingled in the churchyard, Mitchell drew Grace aside. "I need to make my rounds," he said. "But I was wondering if you might join me for supper tonight, just the two of us." Grace's heart fluttered. Would that be proper?" A smile quirked the corner of his mouth. "We could dine at the hotel restaurant, very public and respectable. I just thought, well, we've had little chance to talk without Abigail or the boarders around." "I'd like that," Grace said, returning his smile. That evening, dressed once again in Abigail's green gown, Grace met Mitchell at the Hill City Hotel. The restaurant was small but elegant, with white tablecloths and crystal glasses that caught the light from the oil lamps. "This is lovely," Grace said as Mitchell held her chair. "Best food in town," he replied, taking his seat across from her. "Though don't tell Abigail I said so." They ordered supper roast beef for Mitchell, chicken for Grace, and fell into easy conversation. Mitchell told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, his service in the Union Army during the war, and his decision to head west afterward. "I was restless," he explained. Couldn't settle back into farm life after what I'd seen. So I drifted west, worked as a scout, a ranch hand, even tried my hand at prospecting for a while. "What brought you to law enforcement?" Grace asked. "A sheriff in a little town in Wyoming gave me a chance as a deputy when I was down on my luck. Found I had a knack for keeping the peace without too much bloodshed. When I heard Hill City needed a sheriff, it seemed like a good opportunity to put down roots." "And your sister came with you." A shadow crossed Mitchell's face. "Abigail was married when I first came west. Her husband was a doctor, a good man. They lost a child to fever and then Henry himself took ill and died. I brought her here to make a fresh start." "I'm so sorry," Grace said softly. "She never mentioned." "She doesn't speak of it often," Mitchell said. "The boarding house keeps her busy, gives her purpose." Their food arrived and the conversation turned to lighter topics. Mitchell asked about her life in Boston, and Grace found herself sharing memories she'd almost forgotten: her father's bookshop, her mother's garden, the piano lessons she'd taken until they could no longer afford them. "You miss it?" Mitchell asked. "The city, I mean." Grace considered the question. "Sometimes. I miss the libraries and concerts, the bustle of so many people, but there's something honest about this place that I've come to appreciate. In Boston, everything is hidden behind politeness and propriety. Here, for better or worse, people show you exactly who they are." "Like Harriet Gibson," Mitchell observed wryly. Grace laughed. "Yes, exactly like Harriet Gibson." After supper, Mitchell suggested a walk. The evening was cool but not cold, the stars brilliant above them as they strolled along Hill City's Main Street. Most businesses were closed on Sunday evening, giving the town a peaceful quiet. "Tomorrow will be a big day for you," Mitchell said as they paused near the town square. "Once Judge Patterson makes his ruling, you'll be a woman of independent means." "Thanks to you," Grace said. "If you hadn't found me that night, you'd have managed," he said confidently. "You're stronger than you know, Grace Gibson." The way he said her name sent a pleasant shiver through her. They were standing close now, and Grace was acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to surround him. "Still," she said, her voice soft in the darkness, "I'm grateful for your help, for your friendship." Mitchell's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "Is that what this is? Friendship?" Grace's heart pounded. I don't know what to call it. It seems too soon after Thomas." "Of course," Mitchell said quickly, stepping back slightly. "I wouldn't want to presume—" "No," Grace interrupted, reaching for his hand. "That's not what I meant. I barely knew Thomas in truth. Our marriage was more of an arrangement than a love match, but people would talk if we—" Mitchell squeezed her hand gently. "People will talk regardless. It's what they do in small towns." His voice grew serious. "But I would never do anything to compromise your reputation, Grace. I respect you too much for that." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "I respect you too, Mitchell Stone, and I care for you more than I should after so short an acquaintance." A slow smile spread across his face. "Well then, perhaps we should give ourselves time to make a longer acquaintance." "I'd like that," Grace whispered. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, speaking little but comfortable in the silence. At the front door, Mitchell raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Grace Gibson," he said softly. "Good night, Sheriff Stone," she replied, a smile playing at her lips. Inside, Abigail was waiting in the parlor, pretending to read a book. She looked up with studied casualness as Grace entered. "Did you have a nice evening?" "Very nice," Grace said, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. Abigail set her book aside, her pretense abandoned. "I knew it. I told Mitchell weeks ago that he needed to find himself a wife, and then you appeared on our doorstep like an answer to prayer." "Abigail," Grace protested, laughing. "It's much too soon to speak of such things. We're just getting acquainted." "MMHMM," Abigail hummed, unconvinced. "Well, get acquainted all you like. I haven't seen my brother look at a woman that way since, well, ever." The next morning, Grace dressed with care in her blue dress, which Abigail had freshened with a new collar of white lace. Mitchell arrived to escort her to the judge's office, looking official in his sheriff's uniform. "Are you ready?" he asked. Grace nodded, though butterflies danced in her stomach. "As I'll ever be." Judge Patterson's office was in the town hall, a modest room lined with law books. The judge himself sat behind a large oak desk, while a clerk sat in the corner, ready to record the proceedings. To Grace's dismay, Harriet Gibson was already there, seated ramrod straight in a chair before the judge's desk. She gave Grace a cold nod but said nothing. "Mrs. Gibson, Sheriff Stone, please be seated," Judge Patterson said, gesturing to the vacant chairs. "We're here to discuss the estate of Thomas Gibson, specifically the provisions made for his widow." "My son made no such provisions," Harriet interjected. "Any supposed will was drawn up without proper legal consultation." "On the contrary," Judge Patterson said mildly, "the will I have before me was witnessed by myself and Dr. Wilson 2 years ago, when Thomas returned from his studies in Denver. It's quite legal and specific." He turned to Grace. "Mrs. Gibson, the younger your husband left you a sum of $5,000 to be paid immediately upon his death. He also left you a plot of land at the eastern edge of town, approximately 10 acres, with a small cabin on the property." Grace's eyes widened. $5,000 was a substantial sum, more than enough to establish herself comfortably. "That's impossible," Harriet protested. "Thomas would never, furthermore," the judge continued, ignoring the interruption. "He specified that you were to receive his personal effects, including his books, clothing, and the gold watch that belonged to his grandfather." Harriet rose to her feet. "I will contest this. Thomas was not in his right mind when he made this will. He was barely 25, with no thought of mortality. If he had known, Mrs. Gibson," the judge said firmly, "your son was of sound mind when he made his will. He specifically mentioned that he wished to provide for any future wife, regardless of how long their union might last. He was a sensible young man who understood the uncertainties of life, particularly in this part of the country." Harriet's face flushed with anger. "This Boston girl bewitched him, turned him against his family." "That's enough, Harriet," Mitchell said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Your son made his wishes clear. The law will uphold them." For a moment, it seemed Harriet might continue her tirade, but something in Mitchell's steady gaze made her reconsider. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders with trembling hands. "Very well," she said, her voice brittle. "If the law says she gets my son's money, so be it. But don't expect me to welcome her in town or acknowledge her in any way." "That is your prerogative," Judge Patterson said. "Now, I'll need both of you ladies to sign these documents confirming the transfer of property." With rigid dignity, Harriet signed the papers, then swept from the room without another glance at Grace. Once she was gone, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Don't worry about her," Judge Patterson said kindly. "Harriet Gibson's bark has always been worse than her bite. And now that you have your own means, she can't hurt you." "Thank you, Judge," Grace said sincerely. "I never expected." "Your husband was a good man," the judge said. "Different from his mother, thank heavens. He wanted to make sure you were cared for if anything happened to him." He shuffled the papers on his desk. "Sheriff Stone, perhaps you could show Mrs. Gibson her property when you have a moment. The cabin hasn't been used in some time, but it's structurally sound." "I'd be happy to," Mitchell replied. Outside the town hall, Grace felt light-headed with relief and surprise. "I can hardly believe it," she said as they walked back toward the boarding house. "My own land, a home of my own." "You deserve it," Mitchell said, "and more." "Will you show me the property today?" she asked eagerly. "I'd like to see it as soon as possible." Mitchell smiled at her enthusiasm. "Let me finish my rounds and I'll take you out there this afternoon." True to his word, Mitchell arrived at the boarding house after lunch with 2 horses. "I thought you might like to ride your own mount," he explained. "The property is about 3 miles east of town." Grace changed into her more practical dress and borrowed a pair of Abigail's boots before joining Mitchell outside. He helped her mount the gentle mare he'd brought for her, then swung up onto his own horse. They rode at a leisurely pace, Mitchell pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. The day was perfect for riding, sunny but cool, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and sage. "There it is," Mitchell said at last, pointing to a small cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines. "Your land starts at that creek we just crossed and extends to those hills." Grace reined in her horse, taking in the view. The cabin was small but sturdy-looking, built of hewn logs with a stone chimney. The land around it was mostly cleared, with a few apple trees near the house and a view of the hills beyond. "It's beautiful," she breathed. They dismounted, and Mitchell tied the horses to a hitching post near a small well. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a simple one-room dwelling with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and a bed frame along one wall. "It needs work," Mitchell observed, "but the structure is sound. Thomas used to come out here to hunt sometimes. He talked about fixing it up as a proper home someday." Grace ran her fingers along the table, her mind already filling the space with curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, herbs drying from the rafters. "I could make this a home," she said softly. Mitchell watched her, his eyes warm. "Yes, you could." They spent an hour exploring the property, finding a small stream that ran year-round and several fruit trees in what had once been an orchard. By the time they mounted their horses to return to town, Grace's mind was buzzing with plans. "I'll need supplies," she said as they rode. "Lumber for repairs, glass for the windows, bedding, cookware." "Grace," Mitchell interrupted gently, "you don't have to move out here immediately. You're welcome to stay at the boarding house until the cabin is properly prepared." "I know," she said, "and I'm grateful. But I need to stand on my own to make a place that's truly mine." She glanced at him, suddenly uncertain. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," he assured her. "Independence suits you, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. I'm happy to help with the repairs, and I'm sure Abigail would be glad to assist with the domestic arrangements." "Thank you," Grace said, touched by his understanding. "I'd welcome the help." Over the next few weeks, Grace divided her time between helping at the boarding house and preparing her cabin. Mitchell was true to his word, spending his free time repairing the roof, replacing broken window panes, and building sturdy shutters to keep out the winter winds. Abigail donated spare linens and cookware, and even the boarders contributed. Mr. Jenkins built a bookshelf, while Mr. Dawson, who had a talent for metalwork, fashioned hooks and hinges for the cupboards. Grace used some of her inheritance to order furnishings from Denver: a proper bed, a comfortable chair, a small writing desk. She also bought chickens for eggs, a milk cow, and seeds for a spring garden. Little by little, the cabin transformed from a hunting shelter to a proper home. Throughout this busy time, Grace's feelings for Mitchell continued to deepen. They worked side by side during the day, and in the evenings they often sat on the boarding house porch, talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Sometimes their hands would touch, or Mitchell would tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. These small gestures sent warmth flooding through Grace, awakening feelings she had never experienced in her brief marriage to Thomas. By mid-November, the cabin was ready for Grace to move in. The night before her planned departure from the boarding house, a heavy snow began to fall, blanketing Hill City in white. Mitchell arrived for supper looking concerned. "I don't think tomorrow is a good day for you to move," he said as they sat down to eat. "The snow is getting deep, and the road to your cabin might be impassable." "Surely it's not that bad," Grace said, disappointed. "Everything was packed and ready." "It's coming down pretty hard," Abigail confirmed. "Another day or two won't matter, Grace. Better safe than sorry." Grace reluctantly agreed, but as the evening wore on, she found herself growing increasingly restless. After the boarders had retired and Abigail had gone to bed, she sat with Mitchell in the parlor, watching the snow through the window. "I know it's foolish," she said softly, "but I was so looking forward to spending tomorrow night in my own home." Mitchell studied her face in the lamplight. "It's not foolish to want independence. It's one of the things I admire most about you." "You admire me?" Grace asked, surprised. "More than you know," he replied, his voice low. "Your strength, your dignity in the face of Harriet's cruelty, your determination to build a new life. You're remarkable, Grace Gibson." Grace felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "I've only done what was necessary." "No," Mitchell said, leaning forward to take her hand. "You've done much more than that. When I found you that night, you were at your lowest point, yet you never surrendered to despair. You've worked tirelessly, made plans, looked to the future. That takes courage." "I had help," she reminded him. "Your help most of all." "I only offered a hand when you needed it," he said. "You did the climbing yourself." The earnestness in his voice moved her deeply. Without thinking, Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a brief, sweet kiss. Mitchell looked surprised when she pulled back, but his eyes darkened with pleasure. "What was that for?" he asked huskily. "For believing in me," she whispered. "For seeing me when I felt invisible." This time, it was Mitchell who closed the distance between them, his kiss more assured, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek. Grace felt herself melting into his touch, her heart racing as his lips moved against hers with gentle insistence. When they finally separated, both were breathless. Mitchell rested his forehead against hers, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Grace asked. "I didn't want you to think I was taking advantage of your situation, and I wasn't sure if you were ready after Thomas." Grace placed her fingers over his lips. "Thomas and I were strangers who barely had time to become acquainted before he fell ill. What I feel for you is different, deeper." Mitchell kissed her fingers, then her palm. "I love you, Grace Gibson. I think I've loved you since that first night, when you stood in the rain with your head held high despite everything." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. "I love you too, Mitchell Stone. I never thought I'd find love here, especially not after everything that happened, but you. You showed me what love truly means." They sat together for a long time, talking softly, sharing more kisses, planning a future neither had imagined just months before. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, Mitchell reluctantly rose to leave. "I should go," he said. "It's late, and the snow is getting deeper." Grace walked him to the door, where he gathered her close for one more lingering kiss. "Sleep well," he murmured against her lips. "Tomorrow, snow or no snow, I'll help you move to your cabin." "Be careful going home," she said, watching as he shrugged into his heavy coat and pulled on his gloves. "I will." He touched her cheek one last time, then stepped out into the swirling snow. Grace watched from the window until his figure disappeared into the white darkness, her heart full to bursting with happiness and hope. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the world transformed by several inches of fresh snow. Grace awoke early, eager despite the delay in her moving plans. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mitchell already in the kitchen, talking with Abigail over coffee. "Good morning," he said, rising when he saw her. His eyes held a new warmth as they met hers, a silent acknowledgment of what had passed between them the night before. "Good morning," she replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. Abigail looked from one to the other, her expression knowing. "Well," she said briskly, "I see some things have been settled. About time, too," Mitchell laughed. "Nothing gets past you, does it, Abby?" "Not in my house, it doesn't," she replied tartly, but her eyes were twinkling. "Now, sit down, both of you. I've made flapjacks and there's bacon, too." Over breakfast, they discussed the day's plans. The snow had stopped during the night, and Mitchell reported that the roads were passable, if slippery in spots. "If you still want to move today, I think we can manage it," he told Grace. "I've borrowed Johnson's wagon with the high sides. We can load your things and have you settled by nightfall." "Are you sure?" Grace asked, both excited and nervous at the prospect. "Positive," Mitchell assured her. "And I thought maybe I could stay in town tonight, keep an eye on things until you're comfortable on your own." Grace met his gaze, understanding his unspoken concern. Though Harriet Gibson had been quiet since the judge's ruling, her hostility hadn't abated. Just last week, Grace had encountered her former mother-in-law in the general store and received such a cutting glare that she'd almost dropped her purchases. "I'd appreciate that," Grace said softly. By mid-morning, Grace's belongings were loaded into the wagon, and a tearful Abigail was embracing her on the boarding house porch. "You come back and visit often," Abigail insisted, pressing a basket into Grace's hands. "And here's some bread and preserves to get you started. I've packed enough for two, since I suspect my brother will be taking his meals with you more often than not." "Abigail," Mitchell protested, but he was grinning as he helped Grace up onto the wagon seat. The journey to the cabin took longer than usual due to the snow-covered roads, but the day was sunny and not too cold. Grace sat close to Mitchell on the wagon seat, their shoulders touching, occasionally pointing out tracks in the snow rabbit, deer, fox as they passed. When they arrived at the cabin, smoke was already rising from the chimney. "Who's here?" Grace asked, surprised. Mitchell looked pleased with himself. "I rode out at dawn to start a fire so the place would be warm when you arrived. Didn't want your first day in your new home to be a cold one." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Grace leaned over to kiss his cheek. "Thank you. That was very sweet." Inside, the cabin was indeed warm and welcoming. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the sunlight streaming through the clean windows created patterns on the wooden floor. Grace moved through the space, trailing her fingers over surfaces that were now hers: the table where she would eat her meals, the desk where she would write letters, the bed where she would sleep. Mitchell carried in her trunks and boxes, setting them down carefully. "Where do you want these?" Grace directed him, and together they unpacked her belongings, transforming the cabin into a home. With each item they placed books on the shelves, curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, pots and pans hanging from hooks near the fireplace. As the afternoon waned, Mitchell brought in wood for the night and showed Grace how to bank the fire to keep it burning slowly until morning. He'd also brought a rifle, which he placed on hooks above the door. "You know how to use this?" he asked. Grace nodded. "My father taught me, though it's been some time." "I'll take you out for some practice tomorrow," Mitchell promised, "just to be sure you can protect yourself if needed." They prepared a simple supper from Abigail's basket and their own provisions, working together in the small space with a comfortable familiarity. As they ate by lamplight, Grace felt a deep contentment settle over her. "Happy?" Mitchell asked, observing her peaceful expression. "Very," she replied. "It feels right being here, like I've found my place at last." After supper, they sat before the fire, Mitchell's arm around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against him. The wind had picked up outside, whistling around the corners of the cabin, but inside all was warm and snug. "I should go soon," Mitchell said reluctantly. "It's getting late, and I promised Abigail I'd stop by the boarding house on my way home." Grace nodded, though she was loath for the evening to end. "Of course." Mitchell turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Grace, there's something I want to ask you, but I'm not sure if it's too soon." Her heart quickened. "Ask me." "I love you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. When you're ready, truly ready, I'd be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Grace's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Oh, Mitchell. Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you more than I ever thought possible." Mitchell's face broke into a radiant smile as he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise of their future together. When they finally parted, both breathless, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he admitted, tipping a delicate gold ring with a small pearl into his palm. "It was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would wear it." Grace extended her trembling left hand, watching as Mitchell slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the firelight with a gentle glow. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not as beautiful as you," Mitchell replied, kissing her again. The next morning, Mitchell arrived early, bringing fresh eggs from Abigail's hens and news from town. Grace had been up since dawn, reveling in the quiet solitude of her new home, drinking coffee on the small porch despite the chill in the air. "Good morning, future Mrs. Stone," he called as he approached, his breath visible in the cold air. "Good morning, Sheriff," she replied with a smile, accepting his kiss as he bounded up the porch steps. Over breakfast, they discussed their plans. The wedding would be small and soon, perhaps before Christmas, if Judge Patterson was available to perform the ceremony. They would live at the cabin, which Mitchell had already begun to envision expanding to accommodate a growing family. "I've always wanted children," he admitted. "A whole houseful if you're willing." Grace's heart swelled at the thought. "I'd like that very much. This is a good place to raise children, fresh air, space to run, the stream for swimming in summer." "And loving parents," Mitchell added, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "That's the most important thing." After breakfast, true to his word, Mitchell took Grace out to practice with the rifle. She proved to be a fair shot, hitting the targets he set up on fence posts more often than not. "You'll do just fine," he said approvingly. "Though with any luck, you'll never need to use it except for hunting." They spent the day making plans and preparations for winter, checking the roof for any missed leaks, ensuring the wood supply was ample, discussing which preserves and dry goods Grace would need to stock. In the afternoon, Mitchell had to return to town for his sheriff's duties, promising to come back for supper. Left alone, Grace continued organizing her new home, humming as she worked. She was hanging a small mirror near the door when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Curious, she stepped onto the porch, expecting to see Mitchell returning early. Instead, she was stunned to see Harriet Gibson driving a small buggy up the path to the cabin. The older woman's face was set in its usual stern lines as she reined in the horse and alighted from the vehicle with rigid dignity. "Mrs. Gibson," Grace greeted her cautiously, remaining on the porch. "This is unexpected." Harriet's gaze swept over the cabin and surrounding land, her expression unreadable. "So this is where my son intended to bring his bride," she said at last. He often spoke of this place, though I never understood its appeal. Grace wasn't sure how to respond. Would you? Would you like to come inside? I can make tea. For a moment, she thought Harriet would refuse, but after a pause, the older woman gave a curt nod. Very well. Inside, Grace busied herself with the kettle, acutely aware of Harriet's critical gaze taking in every detail of the cabin. She set out cups and the last of Abigail's sweet bread, her hands trembling slightly with nervousness. It's quite rustic, Harriet observed, seating herself at the table with straight-backed formality. It suits me, Grace replied, bringing the tea. I've never needed grand surroundings to be happy. Harriet's mouth tightened. My son did, or so I always believed, yet he kept this place, came here often. It was a puzzle to me. Grace poured the tea, wondering what had prompted this visit. Mrs. Gibson, may I ask why you've come? Harriet took a sip of tea before answering. I saw you in town yesterday with Sheriff Stone. The way he looked at you, it was clear that things have progressed between you. Grace felt a flush rise to her cheeks. Yes, they have. Mitchell has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. So soon after Thomas, Harriet said, but there was more resignation than accusation in her tone. I cared for Thomas, Grace said carefully, but our marriage was brief and arranged. What I feel for Mitchell is different. Love, Harriet said, the word sounding almost foreign on her lips. I suppose you think me incapable of understanding such a thing. Grace set down her cup, surprised by the vulnerability suddenly visible beneath Harriet's proud exterior. Not at all. I think perhaps you've known great love and great loss, and it's made you protective of what remains of your family. Harriet's eyes widened slightly, as if shocked by Grace's insight. My husband, Walter, was the love of my life, she said after a long pause. When he died, Thomas was all I had left. I wanted the best for him, the right connections, a suitable wife who would enhance his position in society. Instead, he chose a penniless girl from Boston, Grace finished for her. Yes. Harriet's gaze drifted to the window, to the hills beyond. But perhaps he saw something in you that I was too blinded by grief and pride to recognize. The admission, small as it was, stunned Grace into silence. Harriet straightened her shoulders, as if regretting her momentary softness. In any case, I came to give you this. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. It belonged to Thomas's grandmother. He would have wanted you to have it. Grace unwrapped the package with trembling fingers to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Thomas. Thomas's grandfather, Harriet explained. He gave the locket to his wife on their wedding day. It's been passed down since then. Mrs. Gibson, I don't know what to say, Grace whispered, deeply moved by the unexpected gift. Say you'll remember my son kindly, Harriet said, rising to her feet. That's all I ask. Of course I will, Grace assured her, standing as well. He was a good man. Harriet nodded, her composure firmly back in place. And Sheriff Stone, is he a good man as well? The best I've ever known, Grace said without hesitation. Then I wish you happiness, Harriet said formally. Good day, Mrs. Gibson. Grace walked her to the buggy, still stunned by the unexpected reconciliation for that, however subtle, was what it had been. As Harriet prepared to depart, she paused, one hand on the buggy's side. Thomas's father and I were married for 30 years, she said, her voice softer than Grace had ever heard it. In all that time, he never looked at me the way Sheriff Stone looks at you. Hold on to that. It's rare. With that, she climbed into the buggy and drove away, leaving Grace standing in the yard, the locket clutched in her hand and tears of relief and gratitude in her eyes. When Mitchell returned that evening, Grace told him about Harriet's unexpected visit and gift. He listened in amazement, turning the locket over in his hands. "Well, I'll be," he said. "I never thought Harriet Gibson capable of such a gesture." "I think she's lonely," Grace said thoughtfully. "All that wealth, that grand house, and no one to share it with." "You have a generous heart, Grace Gibson," Mitchell said, drawing her into his arms. "One of the many reasons I love you." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church, with Abigail as Grace's attendant and Judge Patterson presiding. The townspeople turned out in force, filling the small church with well wishes and warmth. Even Harriet Gibson attended, sitting stiffly in the back row but nodding to Grace when their eyes met. Afterward, there was a celebration at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. When the last guest had gone, Mitchell took Grace's hand and led her to his waiting wagon. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Stone?" he asked, his eyes full of love and promise. Grace smiled up at him, her heart overflowing with happiness. "More than ready, Sheriff." As they drove through the starlit night toward their cabin, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a mail-order bride cast out by her mother-in-law to a woman who had found not just shelter but true love and belonging. The cabin lights glowed warmly in the distance, a beacon calling them home. "What are you thinking about?" Mitchell asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "How endings can sometimes be beginnings in disguise," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "And how grateful I am that you found me that night." "I'll always find you," he promised, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Wherever you are, I'll always come for you." They rode on through the night, toward their cabin, toward their future, toward all the days and years that stretched before them like an unopened gift, waiting to be discovered together. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of what was now a substantial home, watching as Mitchell played with their children in the summer twilight. Thomas, their 4-year-old son named for Grace's first husband, shrieked with laughter as his father swung him high in the air. Beside them, 2-year-old Sarah toddled after them, determined to keep up with her brother. Grace cradled her swollen belly, feeling the new life within her stir. Another month, and their family would grow again. Mitchell caught her eye across the yard and smiled, that same smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all this time. In the distance, she could see the lights of Hill City beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. The town had grown over the years, with a proper school now where Mitchell served on the board, and a small library that Grace had helped establish with some of her inheritance. Harriet Gibson had softened somewhat with time, especially after Thomas was born. She was not exactly warm, but she acknowledged Grace in town and occasionally sent small gifts for the children. It was a piece of sorts, and Grace was content with it. Abigail had married last year, to everyone's surprise, including her own. Her husband, a widowed doctor who had come to town seeking a fresh start, adored her and had brought joy back into her life. They lived in town, but visited often, bringing treats for the children and news of town happenings. As the sky darkened to deep blue, Mitchell gathered the tired children and brought them up to the porch. "I think these little ones are ready for bed," he said, kissing Grace's cheek. Together they bathed the children, dressed them in nightclothes, and listened to their prayers. After stories and kisses, when both were finally asleep, Mitchell and Grace retreated to the porch, where they often sat in the evenings, watching the stars emerge. "Happy?" Mitchell asked, his arm around her shoulders, his hand gently caressing her belly. "Completely," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "I never imagined such happiness was possible." "Nor I," he admitted. "When I found you that night, I was just trying to do the right thing. I had no idea you would become my whole world." Grace turned to kiss him, still marveling at the love that had grown between them, stronger with each passing day. From the darkest moment of her life had come the greatest blessing, a love that sustained and nourished her, that had given her a family and a home filled with laughter and joy. "I love you, Mitchell Stone," she whispered against his lips, "today, tomorrow, and always." "And I love you, Grace Stone," he replied, "with all that I am and all that I ever will be." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, witnesses to a love born of compassion and kindness, nurtured through hardship and joy, a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together.